evening all. Can you hear us okay? Say hello, Ace.
Hello. Thanks for coming.
Has anyone here seen the YouTube clip? Just in the line, there you go. I told you a few people would have seen it. Well, about 70 million, 80 million, who knows how many more million have seen it by now. And let's jump straight in. Ace, you've been on Oprah in the last year, The View with Whoopi, on television in the United States, China, Australia, New Zealand. The book's been re-released, massive hit on YouTube. Along with your very good mate, John. Tell us, first of all, why isn't John here tonight? And what's this last year been like for you?
An amazing year. John is in London at the moment, and I think he's going to Sweden because the book's being launched there, or the DVD. And he lives between London and Sydney these days. That's why he's not here. He would really have loved to have been here. No, it's been an extraordinary year. Oprah, we got to number 1 in England on the bestseller list, number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list. Incredible to go to China.
Is your book here?
Yes, that's the American version. What's been extraordinary, though, I've loved being able to get up to speed on wildlife conservation. John has remained in touch with it all these years, based in London, and he was a foundation member of the George Adamson Wildlife Preservation Trust. So he has been going back to Africa all these years. I've had quite a different career here, and primarily in Aboriginal art. So it's been great reconnecting with John again on something like this, and involving myself with wildlife conservation. And now, of course, I think it ties in absolutely with climate change and global warming. So really it's the most pressing issue we're facing. How do we live a sustainable life?
No, you mentioned George Adamson. We'll get to him in a moment, and Born Free. Let's go back to the Summer of Love in 1969, and you met up with John in London, two
Yes.
young Aussie blokes on a big adventure. Did you ever expect to find that adventure at Harrods department store, and what happened?
No, but we'd grown up hearing a lot about Harrods, and we had a friend that had tried to order, or wanted to order, a camel through Harrods, so we were aware of it. And we'd both got jobs at Sophisticat, a pine antique furniture shop, and we did squeeze in a bit of sightseeing. So we went to the Tower of London, and we thought we should go to Harrods for the first time. And we did know about the zoo, so we made our way to the zoo, and there were 2 lion cubs.
They had an exotic animals section. They sold exotic animals in the department store.
They did, and on the DVD they actually found some very good footage about the sort of animals Harrods have sold in the past. And in fact, since 1974, with the Endangered Species Act, luckily it is now illegal to own animals like that, and we're not encouraging it at all. But they've sold toucans and tapirs and sort of animals. I'm not even quite sure what they are. The only exotic ones in 1969 were the 2 lion cubs, Christian and his sister. Mind you, we did go back to Harrods a few months ago, and it's all full of the most ghastly accessories. There are a couple of little dogs and cats and birds, but otherwise these ghastly, bejeweled leads and collars, and a bakery and a beauty parlour for pets. It's appalling.
Although the fashion, and there are photographs in the book which are disturbing, the fashion, where you were living...
Fur coats, for example.
Because you were living in World's End in London, and you mentioned in the book that you'd wander around the streets and see David Bowie, the Stones, Malcolm McDowell. What was it like there? What part of London was this?
Well, this was the tail end of the King's Road, and it was called the World's End because I think historically you could expect highwaymen from that point on. It still had a bit of that raffish reputation, in fact. But look, it was an exciting time. Obviously, buying a lion was unusual. You can't... we did know someone with a puma, and there was someone with a civet cat, but luckily it is now illegal, and we do understand how we were encouraging the trafficking in exotic animals
You didn't then, though, did you?
We didn't, and that was the criticism. We did ultimately, I'm jumping ahead, meet Bill Travis and Virginia McKenna, and they were quite critical of us.
All right, before we get to them, at Harrods, you had to speak to the buyer there, the wild animal buyer, Roy Hazel, I think his name was.
Yeah.
How did you convince him that you could look after a lion, and could you? And how much was he?
He was 250 guineas, which was expensive. You probably could have, if you'd shopped around, you probably would have got one cheaply from a circus.
What's that in pounds?
But we got the best.
You'd shopped around for your lion. What's that in pounds? How much would that have been?
Now it's about $6,500. So it was a lot of money, but we'd been working for several years before we went, and we'd got jobs there. But it was a very big amount of money, and neither of us had fantasised about owning lions, so it was an impulse buy.
You were living in a little flat above a furniture shop. How did you convince the buyer at Harrods that you could look after a lion?
I don't think they cared, ultimately. They pretended to. It had a very big basement under the shop, so it was a very good spot for Christian, a huge shop which he could run about when he was young or after hours and play in the jungle of all the legs of the tables and furniture and stuff, and with this big space downstairs. But I don't think... they say that John asked all the right questions. I'm not sure what was wrong with mine. And they said they checked us out, but in fact the Christian's sister, the lioness, who was very unhappy at being a draw card for the crowd, unlike Christian, who could transcend things like that. He did have the most beautiful, even nature. She hated being there, understandably, never liked us as we went in at night to get to know Christian. And she ultimately was bought by someone with a dud check, and in the book, in fact, we have his letter from prison where he wrote to the people at Harrods, because they knew they were concerned about their animals, saying, I sold the lioness, implying it was to an actress who lived on a country estate, and she would be all right, but she was never actually seen again.
But her brother, Christian, went home with you and John. Now, how big, show us with your hands, how big would he have been when you first bought him as a cub?
Oh, well, sort of this high and about this big. And growing very quickly, though.
Well, he was, wasn't he? What were you feeding him, and how quickly was he growing, and where did you keep him?
Oh, well, he lived in this basement, but while he was young, he could run around the shop till he began to frighten customers a bit. Yeah. I don't know why they were frightened, but you couldn't expect them to be cool about it after a certain stage and height. And there was a Moravian on the dog leg of the King's Road, people that know Chelsea. There was a Moravian close that was part of Sir Thomas More's stables. And the Moravians, it was actually a graveyard, so I always laugh at that, trampling over all these bodies. The minister said it was all right, and it just looked like a lovely park, and it was enclosed and safe. So we took him there every afternoon, and although there are a lot of marvellous photographs of him, we did not run all over town taking him to restaurants and things. They were really just
it looks that way from the book, but you weren't carrying him around and showcasing him around.
No, really had a very stable, normal, ordinary life.
Yeah, ordinary life. Yeah. What are you doing? I'm off to look after the lion in the basement. Yeah. Were you worried? How worried were you that he'd knock someone over? I mean, even accidentally, a lion.
Very worried.
Could one of the customers or the couple who owned the shop where you lived and stayed and kept him?
Well, we always just tried to keep one step ahead of him. Like little children, he was always fascinated. He was always quite dangerous with children. I don't know what he would have done, and that's quite often lions and animals with children.
Dangerous in that he was too curious?
Too interested in them.
Right.
Yeah. So you knew no little children. The interesting thing was really, as he was growing, was not letting him realise that he was stronger than us and dangerous.
You write about this in the book.
We couldn't control him.
You decided early on that you would never show him fear, even as he got bigger, that you would never let him get a sense that you were scared of him.
Yeah.
Were there times where you were scared of him? And I'm thinking of a moment you wrote about with a red belt that he'd grabbed and got hold of. Tell us what happened there.
A fur belt.
Fur belt.
It fell off someone's coat. I've forgotten where they were or where the coat ended up. They certainly didn't get their belt back. He picked it up and was chewing it in a very interested way and making sounds I'd never heard before. And then when I went to pull it, he flattened his ears and snarled and hissed in a very nasty way that I'd never seen before. But it was a very clear warning. It was, I'm having this, don't touch it, and everything will be all right. So again, John materialized by then, and we didn't like run off, or we just pretended nothing had happened, that we didn't care about the belt. And that's what I mean about not just trying to display too much fear, or when we were sort of worried about not really being able to control him.
Because the whole time he greeted you by rubbing heads. That's how he liked to greet you. And you played wheelbarrows with him?
That's how they greet themselves, greet each other with their heads. So that's what that was all about. There was a few mad people found us, I don't know why. The girl who played wheelbarrows was Unity Jones. And she'd been in a few Fellini movies, and she was very attractive and strange, and she'd had a lioness in Rome in an apartment that she just got fully grown from a zoo. I suppose only in Italy would they let you do it.
I think they still do in Italy. Yeah.
Her flatmate locked herself in her room for 3 weeks, and she always had to move. I don't know why. So she just found out about the lion and came every day. So this really helped us. If we were like working or whatever, she would always be in the basement with him or go to the garden with him. And she had the most fabulous communication. There was something extraordinary about Christian, though, in that he could communicate very clearly with us. Lions are very intelligent, and George Adamson says that, he loved their capacity for love and trust. But you could just form, as we can with all our animals, but somehow Christian was sort of very special. Anyway, Unity really developed his personality. She could, and she was quite small, so she really had to have a very good relationship with him, because very quickly he was physically much stronger than her. But yes, she played wheelbarrows with him and games like that.
Now,
and we can't find her, unfortunately. We tried to find her in London a few months ago, but I don't know where she's gone.
Well, very quickly also you realised he was getting too big. Yeah. You're going to have to do something, and I know you looked around at... Well, did you think about zoos? And I know you looked at estates and maybe wildlife. There's a big wildlife park in England.
Well, this is sort of the homework we did, which probably impressed Harrods, and we knew we would only have him for about a year, probably, definitely in London at the most. So it was an enormous commitment, but we knew it could only last a year. But we went to Longleat Safari Park, or Lion Park, whatever it's called. It was the first sort of safari park to open outside of Africa. It looked very good. It was the Marquess of Bath's sort of fabulous estate. But we learnt more about them subsequently, and they had put too many lions in with each other. They had had quite a lot of casualties. And then they linked up with Chipperfield, is that the name? That were like a bit too performing animally for us. So we went off them ultimately. But at that time also, the sort of time as it was with John Aspinall, that casino owner, did have tigers, and I think he's still alive and still does have them. So there were wealthy people in England with estates.
So you thought perhaps maybe he might
something like that. That was our best case scenario, and we knew that was better than just a straight zoo. We went to Ilfracombe Zoo, where Christian was born. Mm-hmm. Rather a tacky little zoo, really, the sort that have died out now. Zoos have had to redefine themselves.
I'll ask you about zoos in a moment. Luckily the solution walked in your door, didn't it? Because one day Bill Travers, Virginia McKenna, came to see Christian. Who were they? Came to buy a pine table. Oh, okay. They didn't even know that. No,
they didn't know, yeah.
And these were the two actors from Born Free.
Yeah, and we hadn't seen Born Free, but they were very big stars, so we were aware of them, obviously.
And how quickly did that evolve into, well, we know someone, we could... perhaps?
Well, very quickly. They contacted us quite soon and then said, would you be interested in sending him back to George Adamson and rehabilitating him?
And George, who was George?
Well, George Adamson was a hunter originally. What are they called? A game warden then. Met Joy Adamson, a fascinating, scary sort of woman that had had 2 husbands earlier. Incredibly talented. She could paint. What else could she do? Lots of things.
But George, he was like a lion whisperer, wasn't he?
Well, he was. And she wrote Born Free from George's notes when they released Elsa to the Wild. But she wrote it up, and of course Born Free
it was
in
a
1960.
massive success, the book and the movie.
A huge success, yeah. But you're right, George was like a lion whisperer. Joy wasn't.
No.
She
sounds like a wild animal.
She actually got mauled quite often. She was quite loud, excitable, bad-tempered, quick-moving, all the things that are bad for cats, all of you hopefully cat lovers out there. So she got scratched quite a lot, but George was very calm, a marvellous sort of man. It was an exciting but bad marriage in a lot of ways, and it sort of didn't really last.
Perhaps you should have thrown her to the Christian.
Yeah. And she had chairs covered in lion skins. Could you believe it? And we dared ask her about it.
Oh, dear.
And she said, there are good lions and there are bad lions.
Oh no. Let me move on.
Sorry, she also said, you and your stupid fat English lion. No, George and your stupid fat English lion will get killed.
Yeah.
That was her prediction.
She wished you luck. She wished you luck. Good. Very quickly, you met, who was it, Jim, the filmmaker, the director, James Hill, the director.
Who directed The Avengers.
And it was decided you'd make a film about Christians' repatriation back to the wild in Africa under George Adamson's tenureship.
George was very especially interested in that Christian was a 7th generation European lion.
Yeah.
So he was very interested to see whether his instincts had been impaired. And they hadn't been, as it turned out. I could go into details, but am I jumping?
Well, you're about to. You went back to... Finally, you went to Kenya. You crated him up. But you had to wait for weeks to get the permits.
Well, we had
filming him.
We lived in the country for 3 months with the Travises, waiting as Christian.
And you were filming all through that? Filming
all through that, yeah.
Finally, you get to Kenya. What was your first impression of Kora, where you drove to from Nairobi?
Yeah, north... east, I think.
What did you think of Christian's new home?
Scary. It's very harsh territory because, in fact, that was the delay. I mean, a lot of African politicians thought, lions are their traditional enemy. Do we need another lion from London here? This is a bit ridiculous. But George did have a lot of support for his work at the same time. But it had to be land that no one else wanted, that tourists wouldn't go there, that villagers didn't live there. There wasn't an imbalance of wildlife, things like that. So it was a very remote part of Africa.
As worried as he was about whether or not Christian could be returned to the wild, he was possibly more worried about you two, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. That's what he said in the foreword to the book, that very quickly he thought Christian would be fine. He saw him stalk a gombe. He saw him take thorn out of his paws. Christian knew the etiquette when he finally met the 9-year-old boy that was to be the centre of the pride.
He had the instincts.
But George did say... he quite quickly felt good about Christian, but he wasn't so sure about John.
That could have been the pants and the shirt you were wearing, though, I think.
You're dying to talk about that.
I am. I wanted you to wear it tonight.
The 60s wasn't a good time for clothes, especially the tail end. It was sort of the tail end of Carnaby Street. And in fact, the filmmakers asked us to look very King's Road. Yes, they were the clothes we owned. We were moving on, I'd like to think, into... I'm not quite sure what. There was a nice suit I liked at Yves Saint Laurent.
Look how far we've come. But then the other thing...
They wanted us to look King's Roady. Don't cut your hair.
In the movie. But
keep all those hideous clothes and wear them.
But then why did they dub your voices in the movie?
Well, I only had one line and they dubbed it. I was very offended. And it was I've got something to show you in the basement downstairs. It was when they came into the shop, the recreation. I don't know why they said my voice wasn't Australian enough. So they pulled in a very bad actor who did a very bad Australian accent. And it's still there on that. It's still there on that documentary.
We've come so far in the Australian film industry, haven't we?
Yeah, that was the British film industry.
Yeah. So he was there. Boy was the 9-year-old line, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it took a while, but Christian eventually started. You and John. Okay. How long were you there with him before he started to become comfortable?
We were there several weeks at a time, and then when they'd finally met, which was very terrifying. Christian knew the right etiquette. Any male, younger male line is a threat to the older, senior male line, so he did not really want another one around. Christian was very patient. He knew he had to roll on his back in submission. He knew all his etiquette was there after 7 generations, which was quite extraordinary. And he was courageous. He didn't run away, which he could have done. But Boy put him down for weeks and weeks and weeks, and it was very sad. There was a Catania, a little lioness, and Boy, they got on well, and Catania got on well with Christian. She was like the intermediary initially. And we'd go for a walk every evening, and then we'd go and bring them back in the cool of the evening. And Christian was always trailing right behind. And that went on for months. And then they were mad on each other and inseparable. And
you were able to leave and return to
London? And we were able to leave,
That was 1970?
That was 1970. Yeah.
How long was it? You got updates, I presume?
We got updates, yes. We were in a very remote part of Africa, but George wrote to us, and visitors came through, and Bill Travers came and went a few times, so we were kept up to date all the way through.
How long was it before you got to jump on a plane and go back and hopefully see Christian again?
We went back a year later.
Now, what did they tell you when you went to see Christian about whether or not he'd even recognise you all?
George was absolutely confident he'd remember us and that we'd get a very good greeting. He just was surprised what a good greeting we got, though.
And it was all captured on film. And that's
luckily, they were still making the second documentary on George's work and the pride he was putting together at Cora. There are now 80% less lions in Africa than there were at Christian's time. And that's across so many animals. So we really are at a tipping point. I mean, isn't it just the most frightening statistic?
It is.
80% less lions.
Astonishing.
So his work's incredibly valuable. Our documentary to an extent, but all the documentation. George then lived there for another 18 years, I think, and another at least 16 lions came through, apart from the work that he did before.
And the trust still goes, and his assistant still runs that?
Well, Tony Fitzjohn came to work with George in 72, and he took over after George was killed in 1989 by poachers. Tony started, and people like John were foundation members. So the George Adamson Wildlife Preservation Trust goes on. They were given a vast area of land in Tanzania that had been very run down. It's now a national park, and they've put animals that were no longer there, like elephants are back there now. They introduced rhinos there, so it's been an incredible success story. It got upgraded to a national park. And what was very interesting for me, and what John speaks about beautifully, is how every animal is necessary in the hierarchy. You can't just do without any of them. They all have their roles to play, and when anyone goes, let alone a top order predator like a lion, there's just an extraordinary imbalance.
Now, so many people know about the Trust and the work they do and support them, and so much more money's coming in because of this YouTube clip. And I want to ask you, why do you think it's captured the imagination of tens of millions? It's probably up over 100 million now. It's up there with Susan Boyle from Britain's Got Talent, so it's right up there in the big league. But because I know for me it was, you hadn't seen Christian for a year. He was, how big was he roughly by then? Just show us with your hands. How big would he? Yeah. I
Well,
mean,
he
was
stood
gigantic.
up about that. Well, look,
But
did
the thing is, he
people
came
see that?
sprinting towards you. The thing that astonished me is you didn't flinch. You didn't for a
No.
moment think that he'd bowl you over or be too or let alone attack you.
We had this goofy look on our faces.
You did.
We knew him so
I couldn't
well.
believe it.
And it's just like how you know anyone. You know their body language or you know their behaviour. We could tell from the excited grunts, the look, the expression on his face. I can't describe what the expression on his face was, but we could tell that that was pleasure and excitement as he ran towards us.
Do you think this the thing that gets people is the fact that you had that bond, that love with him, or was it about growing up and separating? Is it about reuniting? What do you think?
I think there must be a lot of elements. Well, it took me a while to remember that, people would be wondering if we were going to be eaten as the lion ran towards us. I always thought Whitney Houston singing "I'll Always Love You" was a bit of a clue everything would be all right. So there's that fear element.
Although she withdrew the song from YouTube, didn't
What?
she? She withdrew the song from YouTube.
She did. That's why no one really knows what our numbers are.
After you resurrected her career, she pulled the song.
Yes, we've resurrected a career, and what thanks do we get? You know, all that 60 million pulled off our numbers.
Oh.
So where were we?
Well, he didn't eat you. I mean, I just want to quickly mention
love. It's probably about love.
And
people are thinking about their own animals. I think it
that
comes
wasn't
back
the
to
last
that.
time, though. A lot of people think that's the last time you saw him. You saw him once more.
No, we went back a year later, and he was very big then, much more adult, much more mature, less interested in us. We were irrelevant to his life. We didn't mind though. That was the whole point. It was such a success, his rehabilitation.
That's what I want to ask, because a lion in the wild, what's the sort of life expectancy of a lion in the wild, and do you ever regret? Because you really don't know what happened to him after that,
No.
do you? Do you ever regret or wonder if perhaps he might have had a better life if you kept him in captivity, or how do you feel about that?
Okay. It was very tough there. The wild lions always gave Cora, that was the site we were at, and the George Adamson Trust are rehabilitating that. It got incredibly run down. So we'd got him to George Adamson, who knew more about lions than anyone else, but the wild lions were always killing some of the lions George brought in, and a male lion could never establish a territory there. That's what Christian was faced with. So he and Boy ultimately got killed. Christian, they had to go a long way off to try and find a place where they could live. Now, so we imagine Christian may have taken over another pride, which younger lions do, and you could never come back to see George. You could never leave your pride unprotected. So we really don't know, and that's quite a beautiful ending, I think. So to answer your question, we don't regret it. He had several years and the chance to live a wild life compared to, and they can live up to about 9 or 10 years in the wild, or 17 or 18 years in a zoo, but that's no life.
When you write about zoos in the book, the way you phrase it, it's sort of like we don't see the point in being anti-zoo because of, well, this, that. I mean, how do you feel about zoos?
Well, this, that and the other is that they've had to redefine themselves. The worst sort of zoos, hopefully around the world, have been closed down. There's a better legal framework for it now. But with the conservation problems we're facing, with the species extinction we're facing, with diseases jumping from animals to humans, with like the tumours on the Tasmanian devils, zoos are leading a lot of this very important research and funding a lot of it. So they've had to redefine themselves, and they're much more mindful of the animals' safety and the conditions they live in. So we're not anti-zoo. We're not for them either. They're sort of something we need to live with. We support Taronga especially, though, for all the reasons I've just said, especially all the valuable research work they're doing.
I've covered almost everything I wanted to ask you about, but Christian never ultimately attacked you or injured you, did he? He never clawed you, he never knocked you down, he never hurt you. But I notice your hands are a bit swollen and bruised. What's happened?
A dog mauled me. Don't clap, you know? No. And
well, they're easy to train, aren't they?
Yeah. It is ironic. And mind you, look, I'd really rather talk about the poor reporter. See what happens to reporters, Brian? That one that was attacked in the cage in South Africa on the news last night.
Yeah, just a couple of days ago.
And that line was only 1 year old. So you think we still had Christian in England at 1 year. So that's what he was capable. That's what we were dealing with.
And just like, would you go into the lion enclosure at Taronga now?
No, I'm terrified of lions now. And dogs. Since the other day.
Well, thanks for coming into this Lion's Den tonight. That was lovely. Thank you, Ace. Please
Thank
join
you
me in
very
thanking
much.
me, Anthony Ace Bourke.